So I want you to imagine for a second that you've just been tasked with navigating a massive, totally unprecedented global crisis.
Right, like millions of lives on the line.
Exactly. Millions of lives, the economy is teetering, and the sheer weight of all that responsibility is just sitting squarely on your shoulders.
It's incredibly stressful.
Oh, it's a nightmare. But to guide you through the storm, you're handed a map. Except, well, it isn't a normal map at all. It's this completely opaque black box.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. You can't look inside it. You have no idea about the mechanisms driving it, but every single day, it just spits out a set of numbers, and those numbers tell you exactly what to do.
So you just have to trust it.
Right. The question for you is, do you follow that black box blindly?
I mean, that's the ultimate dilemma, isn't it?
It really is. And for the Dutch government during the pandemic, the answer was largely yes. And now, sitting here in 2026, against the backdrop of this ongoing parliamentary inquiry into the handling of the whole COVID-19 crisis, two prominent academics are basically trying to tear open that black box.
Yeah, and that brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are unpacking a really fascinating and honestly highly contentious 2026 interview from a Dutch YouTube channel. It's called Follow the Science.
Right. Follow the science.
Exactly. And the journalist sits down with two major figures. You have Michaéla Schippers, who's a professor of behavior and performance management at Erasmus University, and Ronald Meester. He's a professor of probability and statistics at Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam.
So two very different fields of expertise there.
Completely. And their critique in this interview, I mean, it goes way beyond the standard retroactive debates we usually hear about masks or, social distancing.
Yeah, they're digging into something much deeper.
They are fundamentally questioning the tension between mathematical modeling, societal well-being, and political leadership. They're basically arguing that we need to look at what actually happens to a society when the phrase "follow the science."
Right, we heard that everywhere.
Exactly, when that phrase transforms from a guiding principle into, well, a political shield.
Yeah. And I think we should establish right off the bat for everyone listening, our goal here today is just to unpack the specific arguments and perspectives that these two professors present in this source material.
Right, it's strictly their lens.
Exactly. We are looking through their lens at this immense tension between cold data and actual human behavior. We aren't endorsing or condemning any of it, just impartially laying out their findings. And I think that tension really starts with Michaéla Schippers.
Yeah, her background is really the key to understanding her whole perspective.
It is, because she isn't a virologist. She isn't an epidemiologist running infection models. Her field is positive psychology.
Right.
She studies behavior, performance management, and, how to optimize human well-being on a macro scale.
And her starting point in the interview is that when the pandemic hit, the global response almost immediately created this massive blind spot.
A blind spot in what sense?
Well, the medical establishment and political leaders, they were entirely focused on the daily case counts.
Right, the dashboards.
Exactly, the dashboards. The immediate acute threat of the virus. But Schippers, she was looking at the mitigation measures being deployed, the lockdowns, the societal isolation, the
disruption of just everyday human interaction.
Yeah. And she concluded very early on that these interventions were going to cause catastrophic long-term damage to global mental health and just societal stability in general.
Which is wild, because she actually published a paper on this incredibly early. I mean, we're talking June 2020.
Oh, wow, that early.
Yeah, very early. It was titled The Great Devastating Side Effect of the COVID-19 Crisis. And the statistics she cites in this 2026 interview regarding the fallout of those measures, they are just jarring.
What kind of numbers is she pointing to?
So she points to data suggesting that 80% of people who were already struggling with mental health issues before the pandemic, they felt significantly worse because of the isolation measures.
80%?
Yeah.
That's massive.
It's a huge portion of an already vulnerable population. But she doesn't just stop at the Netherlands. She zooms out to look at the global supply chain and the economic impacts. She argues that global hunger actually doubled as a downstream effect of these massive societal shutdowns.
Doubled. Wow. The argument she's making there, it touches on this really fiercely debated concept in public health collateral damage.
Right, the invisible toll.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because in an acute crisis, the immediate biological threat, it just tends to monopolize all the resources, all the attention. Behavioral science and psychology, they often get pushed entirely to the periphery.
Because there's slower metrics.
Yeah. They deal with slower, much more complex, and less immediately visible issues. You can't chart a panic attack as easily as a positive test result on a daily dashboard.
That makes total sense.
But Schippers contends that you just cannot surgically alter the fundamental social behaviors of a complex global society without triggering massive cascading downstream effects.
Trying to visualize how that kind of targeted intervention causes systemic failure, it actually makes me think of a medical analogy.
Oh, like what?
So say a patient comes into a hospital with a severely broken finger. The doctor's absolute singular priority is making sure that specific bone heals perfectly.
Yeah, sure. That's the acute crisis.
Exactly. So the doctor decides the absolute best way to protect that finger from being bumped or used is to buy the entire patient into a full body cast for a year.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The localized problem is addressed through this extreme systemic restriction.
Yes. So a year later, they take the cast off, and hey, the finger is perfectly straight. The localized metric is a total success.
But the collateral damage is disastrous.
Completely. The patient now has severe muscle atrophy across their entire body. Their cardiovascular health has plummeted from a year of not moving, and their joints are incredibly stiff. The intervention used to cure the finger basically created a systemic crisis that is way harder to treat than the original break.
That is a really powerful way to look at it. And building on that analogy, Schippers argues that the muscle atrophy is exactly what society is dealing with right now in 2026.
The psychological atrophy.
Precisely. She points to the current landscape of mental health care in the Netherlands, and she highlights these 8-month waiting lists just to see a therapist.
8 months, that's basically inaccessible.
Right. She describes mental health services that are so overwhelmed they are practically paralyzed. And she points to this really terrifying increase in suicidal thoughts, particularly among young people.
Because they bore the brunt of the social isolation.
Yeah, they lost their formative social years.
Yeah.
And her frustration in the interview, I mean, you can really feel it. It is palpable. She describes feeling like she was ringing the alarm bell back in 2020 and was just largely ignored by the establishment.
Yeah, like she was screaming into the void. Yeah.
Exactly. And from her perspective, we now have a population that is essentially walking around with profound, totally unaddressed trauma. She actually uses this striking phrase in Dutch saying people are walking around with their souls under their arms.
Wow, with their souls under their arms. That is a haunting image.
It really is. It forces you to think about the metrics we choose to value and broadcast during a crisis.
Yeah.
Right, we were all glued to those highly visible dashboards, the daily infection rates.
The hospital admissions.
Yeah. But the invisible metrics of human flourishing, like societal connections, psychological stability, they were plummeting in the background. And there was no dashboard to track them.
No dashboard at all. Which, it brings up this foundational question about how we even define public health. I mean, is health just the absence of a specific virus? Or does it encompass the holistic behavioral functioning of a society?
And Schippers' perspective is basically a plea to recognize that humans are intrinsically social creatures. Suspending basic social behaviors indefinitely, it causes structural damage to the human psyche. And she argues that damage needs to be weighed just as heavily as the biological threats when you're formulating public policy.
So that really covers the human behavioral side of the equation that they discuss. But I want to pivot to the other side of this.
The numbers side.
Exactly. The side that supposedly drove the justification for the full body cast in the first place. And this is where we bring in Professor Ronald Meester.
Right, because his entire domain is probability, statistics, and mathematical modeling.
Yeah, and his critique in this interview is aimed squarely at the predictive models used by the RVM, which is the Dutch Public Health Institute.
Right, and those models were essentially the absolute bedrock of the government's entire pandemic policy.
They really were. So while Schippers analyzes the collateral damage of the interventions, Meester focuses his analytical lens on the mathematical foundation that justified those interventions.
And his assessment is incredibly critical. I mean, he argues that the models used by the government were fundamentally flawed because they were treated as a black box.
So when he says black box, he means that other independent scientists couldn't actually look under the hood to see how the math was being done.
That is the core of his complaint. The actual code and the parameters were kept hidden. And in the scientific method, transparency and reproducibility, they are non-negotiable.
Right. You have to be able to check the work.
Exactly. If a government is going to make a sweeping policy claim based on a mathematical model, Other experts in the field need to be able to review the parameters. They need to test the underlying assumptions and challenge the conclusions.
But Meester states that these models were closed off from peer review entirely.
Yeah, they were presented to the public and to the parliament as finished, unquestionable products.
Okay, let me push back on this a bit, or at least play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Aren't mathematical models fundamentally objective by nature? I mean, math is math, right? 2 plus 2 is 4. So how can a mathematical model be anything other than a neutral, objective tool? He actually referred to these models as becoming an ideology in the interview, which feels like a remarkably strong word to apply to statistics.
It does sound strong, but that assumes the model is merely calculating an absolute truth rather than simulating a complex reality based on human estimates.
Ah, okay.
A mathematical model is not an infallible oracle. It is essentially a piece of software, and its output is entirely dependent on the human assumptions programmed into it.
So the subjective part is what you feed into the math.
Exactly. Take a model designed to predict city traffic. The programmer has to input assumptions, like what percentage of people will choose to drive today?
Right.
How much will a light drizzle slow down the average speed? What is the probability of a multi-car pileup on the main highway? If the programmer's assumptions are flawed, the math will perfectly, flawlessly calculate a totally incorrect outcome.
Oh, I see. So the math might be executing perfectly, but the foundation it's built on is subjective. It's the classic garbage in, garbage out scenario.
Precisely. And Meester's profound point is that if a model cannot be scrutinized, if the assumptions baked into it cannot be tested, debated, or challenged by the broader scientific community, then it literally ceases to be science.
It becomes dogma.
Yes. It transitions into dogma. He uses the word ideology because the public and the policymakers are being asked to place unquestioning faith in a system purely because it outputs authoritative-looking numbers.
Without any ability to verify how those numbers were actually generated.
Right, which brings us to what might be the most absurd and honestly revealing anecdote in the entire interview.
Oh, the leaked footnote story.
Yes, it is a moment that really underscores the disconnect between the perception of these models and their reality.
It's wild. So Meester's describing this environment where the government is keeping all their models completely locked down.
Right.
They're refusing to release the underlying data to independent academics.
Total secrecy.
But somehow, one of these highly influential RVM models actually leaks to the public. And it doesn't leak in some dramatic, coordinated whistleblower data dump.
No, it accidentally gets printed in the fine print.
Literally buried in the footnotes of a standard parliamentary letter.
It's almost comical. And when Meester, who again is a seasoned professor of probability, when he finally gets the opportunity to look at the actual mathematical framework that is driving national policy, he is appalled by what he sees.
Yeah, he explicitly says the model was so simplistic and so completely detached from the actual complexities of reality that if a second-year university student submitted that model to him for a class assignment, he would give them a failing grade.
A failing grade. He'd tell him to start all over again.
Which is terrifying when you consider what was at stake.
Absolutely. And to understand why he is so critical, we have to look at what makes a model simplistic in this context. An epidemiological model trying to predict a pandemic, it needs to account for an almost infinite number of variables.
Like what? Human behavior changes.
Yeah, human behavior, seasonal effects, varying transmission rates in different environments, the impact of partial immunity. If a model lacks these complex parameters and relies on just overly rigid, static assumptions, any small error in the initial data will compound exponentially over time.
So it just snowballs into fiction.
Exactly. And according to Meester, when you compared the real-world outcomes to what these simplistic models predicted, the reality consistently fell wildly outside the model's provided margins of uncertainty.
Wait, so they weren't just a little bit off?
No, they weren't just slightly off target. They were systematically failing to predict reality.
Wow. Yet, despite this systemic failure, these were the numbers the government was relying on to make sweeping, society-altering decisions.
Yeah.
And this structural reliance on questionable data, it brings us to one of the most tense and heavily debated topics discussed in the interview, the issue of excess mortality.
Or as it's known in Dutch, oversterfte.
Right, oversterfte. And excess mortality is an incredibly complex statistical concept. At its core, it is the reality that more people are dying in a given period than statistical history would suggest is normal.
But Meester points out a fundamental challenge here. To calculate what is excess, Well, you first have to rigorously define what is expected.
You need a baseline.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Without a model of expected mortality, you have absolutely no way of knowing if you are exceeding it. And this is where the controversy in the Dutch context really heats up.
Because calculating that baseline isn't as simple as just looking at last year's deaths, is it?
Not at all. Calculating expected mortality usually involves taking an average of deaths over the past several years, but then you have to adjust for shifting demographics.
Like an aging population.
Yeah, an aging population or seasonal variations like a particularly harsh winter flu season. It is a very delicate statistical balancing act. And according to Meester, there was a highly controversial shift in how this monitoring was handled.
Shifted how?
The responsibility moved from the CBS, which is Statistics Netherlands, over to the RIVM.
The Public Health Institute again?
Right. And after this shift occurred, the IVM adjusted the baseline. They raised the expectation of normal deaths for the coming period by roughly 13%.
Wait, 13%?
13%.
Let me try to visualize the mechanics of that baseline shift because it's a bit abstract.
Sure.
Imagine I walk into a retail store to buy a winter jacket that has historically always cost $100.
Okay.
But before I get there, the store owner quietly changes the price tag, raising the baseline price to $150.
Right.
Then they put a massive sign in the window shouting, "Huge sale, $20 off." So now the jacket costs $130.
I see where you're going.
They've manipulated the baseline expectation to make it look like the price is dropping, or at least holding steady under the sale, even though the raw cost I'm paying out of pocket is significantly higher than the original historical norm of $100.
That analogy captures the mathematical mechanics perfectly. By raising the baseline of what is considered normal mortality by 13%, the mathematical gap between those expected deaths and the actual recorded deaths just shrinks.
It just disappears on paper.
Exactly. The excess mortality mathematically appears much smaller, simply because the baseline of expectation was moved up to meet the rising numbers.
But the raw absolute number of people dying hasn't changed at all. The bodies are still there.
And that is Meester's central argument regarding the data. He asserts that despite this statistical baseline shift, which minimizes the appearance of the problem, if you look purely at the raw, unadjusted data, there has been an undeniable numerical increase in deaths.
An actual spike.
Yes. Furthermore, he notes that this anomalous increase in raw numbers started roughly around the beginning of the vaccination campaigns. And alarmingly, it includes younger age groups who historically would not be expected to die in those numbers.
Okay, I want to pause here and be incredibly clear for anyone listening.
Yeah.
We are strictly unpacking the arguments and the data interpretations presented by Professor Meester in this specific 2026 interview. We are not endorsing a medical conclusion or validating a specific cause for these numbers.
No, absolutely not.
But what stands out in the source material is Meester's posture toward this data, because he isn't sitting in the interview claiming he has all the definitive biological answers for why this is happening.
Exactly. He is approaching it strictly as a statistician. He is looking at a glaring, undeniable anomaly in the raw data and asking the most fundamental scientific question possible. Why is this happening?
What are the variables driving this spike?
Right. But his deep frustration, which he articulates very clearly, is that he finds complete lack of what he calls a curiosity for the truth within the scientific and political establishment.
A lack of curiosity.
Yeah, instead of a collaborative, urgent rush to investigate this anomaly from all angles, he feels there is active obstruction. He states that the debate over what is causing these raw numbers simply cannot and may not be held in official circles.
Man, if you think about the implications of that, it's deeply concerning. If the scientific community loses its curiosity, if researchers stop asking why when the data does something highly unexpected, what is the actual function of science in that society?
Meester suggests it speaks to a severe chilling effect within the establishment. When asking a purely statistical question about raw data becomes politically or socially taboo, science stops functioning as a mechanism for truth discovery.
It just becomes an enforcement tool.
Exactly. It becomes a mechanism for consensus enforcement. It becomes about protecting the narrative rather than exploring the anomaly.
And that enforcement mechanism, the protection of the narrative, it relies heavily on the political class, which naturally transitions us into analyzing the profound disconnect described in the interview between the technocrats generating the data and the elected politicians who are actually enacting the laws.
And Meester provides a very sharp structural critique of how the Dutch parliament, the Tweede Kamer, functioned during the crisis. He paints a picture of a legislative body that was fundamentally ill-equipped to handle, process, or challenge the technical data they were being fed by the health institutes.
Because he points out the obvious but crucial fact that these parliament members are politicians. They are not data scientists or epidemiologists.
Right, they're completely out of their depth.
They completely lacked the technical expertise to actually understand the complex mathematical models being used to justify national policy. And the procedural rules of the government seemed almost designed to exacerbate that ignorance.
How so?
Well, according to the interview, parliament members were frequently handed these highly complex, dense presentation slides from public health officials mere moments before massive policy votes were supposed to take place.
Moments before.
Literally, they had no time to consult independent experts or even digest the information.
The environment he describes sounds incredibly restrictive. I mean, Meester notes that during these briefings, parliament members were often only allowed one single question per political faction.
One question for the whole faction.
Yes. He actually spoke to various members of these factions who privately admitted to him that they were so utterly lost by the technical jargon and the mathematical modeling, they didn't even know what to use their single question on.
They didn't know enough to even form a coherent inquiry.
Exactly. So the picture being painted is of a representation of the people that is flying completely blind. They don't understand the black box models. They don't have the time or the procedural power to effectively question the models.
And yet they are rubber-stamping sweeping policies that fundamentally alter the fabric of everyday society.
Yes.
And all of this is operating under the umbrella of a very famous phrase used repeatedly by the Dutch Prime Minister at the time, Mark Rutte. He publicly stated that the government would steer on the compass of scientists and follow the science.
Ah, yes. Follow the science. That phrase brings up a massive philosophical dilemma that Meester spends a significant amount of time unpacking.
It has to, because it begs a massive question about leadership. If the elected politicians don't understand the science they're voting on, and the scientists are just running black box mathematical models based on subjective assumptions, who is actually making the moral decisions for society?
Who is weighing the consequences?
Exactly. Who is weighing the consequences of the broken finger against the devastation of the podcast?
Meester highlights this as a fundamental misunderstanding of what science actually is. And the distinction he draws is vital. Science is descriptive. It is not normative.
Okay, unpack that for me. Descriptive versus normative.
So science can describe the physical world. It can tell you how an airborne virus spreads in an unventilated room. It can tell you the statistical probability of infection based on proximity.
Okay, so it gives you the mechanics.
Right. But science cannot tell you if closing a school for a year and thereby causing a massive, measurable spike in youth depression, isolation, and educational deficits is the right or good thing to do for a society.
Because right and good are moral judgments.
Precisely. They require weighing competing human values against each other, which isn't a math equation.
You can't put a moral value into an algorithm.
You really can't. And Meester argues that by constantly deploying the mantra to follow the science, politicians were effectively abdicating their core moral responsibility. The burden of political leadership requires balancing competing societal needs, making incredibly difficult, often tragic trade-offs, and then standing accountable for those choices.
But by pointing to the models, leaders dumped that moral burden onto the shoulders of statistics.
Yes, it functions as the ultimate political shield. If a policy destroys a sector of the economy or severely damages a generation's mental health, the politician can simply shrug and say, "Don't blame me, I just followed the science. The math told me to do it."
Wow. And Meester makes the point that true science inherently requires debate, right? It requires intense disagreement.
Always.
It requires independent groups of people looking at the exact same data set and challenging each other's assumptions and conclusions. So when politicians demand scientific consensus so they can formulate a unified, unquestionable public policy, they are actually making a deeply anti-scientific demand.
Yeah, they're asking for certainty where only probability and theory exist.
It creates a dangerous feedback loop.
Yeah.
In that environment, dissenting scientific voices like Schippers warning about the behavioral fallout or Meester questioning the baseline shifts, they are viewed not as a necessary, healthy part of the scientific process, but as political obstacles.
Obstacles that need to be cleared away to maintain the illusion of consensus.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final major theme of this interview, which really looks at the aftermath, cancel culture, sunk costs, and the path forward. Because the reality on the ground in 2026 is that both Professor Schippers and Professor Meester are on the outside looking in.
Yeah, despite their deep expertise in their respective fields, they are largely sidelined from this massive, ongoing parliamentary inquiry into the pandemic.
Which is just crazy to think about.
It is, and the mechanics of their exclusion are quite telling regarding how institutions protect themselves.
How so?
Well, Schippers mentions that she actually did testify before a preliminary committee years ago. However, she was required to do so under a strict non-disclosure agreement. Complete secrecy regarding her testimony.
So she couldn't talk about what she said.
Right. And since that closed-door session, she has never been asked back. Meester, dealing with the statistical anomalies of excess mortality, has simply never been invited by the current committee to share his analysis of the modeling or the data at all.
But the interview reveals this quiet, almost insidious, behind-the-scenes reality that Schippers exposes. She recounts a private conversation she had with the head of communications at her own university faculty.
Oh, this part was striking.
It was. Privately, behind closed doors, this communications director admitted to Schippers that she was right all along, that the mitigation measures were indeed too damaging, that the collateral behavioral fallout was immense, and that her initial warnings were entirely justified.
The crucial caveat to that conversation, though, is that the communications director refused to state any of that publicly.
Right.
And meanwhile, Schippers' own university had publicly distanced itself from her earlier statements and has never issued a public rectification or apology, even as her warnings about the mental health crisis have undeniably materialized into reality.
It sounds like the ultimate form of institutional gaslighting. I mean, you are validated as being correct in private, but you remain a pariah in public because admitting you were right would damage the institution's reputation.
Exactly. And Meester shares a very similar, very recent parallel that proves this phenomenon isn't just isolated to COVID-19.
What happened?
He recently wrote a scientific advisory report on the Dutch nitrogen crisis, the stikstof crisis, which is this massive environmental and agricultural debate in the Netherlands right now.
Okay.
And when his report was brought to Parliament, politicians from certain parties flatly refused to even hold a debate on it. They preemptively labeled his scientific work as disinformation without having read a single word of the report.
Without reading it, that is wild.
Yeah. And this behavior highlights a deep psychological and sociological barrier to crisis recovery, the sunk cost fallacy, and the intense fragility of the human ego, particularly in leadership.
The sunk cost fallacy is huge here.
Both professors argue that the media, the public health institutions, and the politicians made such extreme, hostile, and absolute statements during the height of the pandemic that they are now entirely trapped by their own rhetoric.
I mean, think about the psychology of that for a second. If a politician spent 2 years publicly demonizing anyone who questioned the RAVM models as a literal danger to society, it is almost psychologically impossible for them to sit down at a table in 2026, look at the excess mortality data or the mental health waiting list and say, you know what? The models were fundamentally flawed, the collateral damage was worse than the disease in many aspects, and I was wrong to push those policies.
Right, because their egos, their current careers, and their historical public reputations are entirely built on the foundation of them having been absolutely right during the crisis.
To admit fault now wouldn't just be a minor correction, it would be viewed as professional suicide.
It is a massive institutional sunk cost. They have invested so much political and social capital into one specific narrative, the narrative that the extreme measures were the only possible scientific path that they have to protect that narrative at all costs.
Well, even if protecting it means actively ignoring raw data anomalies.
Or silencing esteemed professors who point out the mathematical flaws.
So, if that is the reality, if the institutional system is too fragile and too ego-driven to admit its massive mistakes, how on earth does the society actually fix it? Because the natural human instinct, especially when people feel their lives or livelihoods were ruined by government overreach, is to demand retribution.
Oh, absolutely.
You hear people demanding tribunals, people wanting politicians and health officials put on criminal trial for the collateral damage they caused.
But Schippers addresses this directly, and she provides a profoundly historically grounded insight. She strictly warns against the instinct for tribunals or punitive trials.
Why? Wouldn't that bring accountability?
Drawing on her expertise in behavioral science, she notes that historically tribunals do not heal fractured societies. They usually just deepen the existing divide.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, when leaders are threatened with jail time or total ruin, they will double down, hide evidence, and create a new cycle of resentment and polarization. Tribunals force people into a defensive crouch.
So if trials only make the cover-ups worse, what is her proposed alternative to actually achieve accountability?
She advocates for a model heavily inspired by post-apartheid South Africa, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Oh, a truth commission.
Right. The fundamental goal of a truth commission isn't to lock people up or seek vengeance. The goal is radical transparency and societal healing. It is an environment focused purely on uncovering the facts, admitting what went wrong, and putting everything on the table without the immediate, paralyzing threat of criminal prosecution hanging over the participants' heads.
You know, the logic there really makes sense. If a politician or a modeler knows they might go to jail if they admit they manipulated a baseline or ignored a psychological warning, they will literally take that lie to the grave.
The instinct for self-preservation is just too strong.
Exactly. But if you remove the threat of prosecution, you might actually get them to explain the why they made the choices they did, what pressures they were under, and how the system failed.
It creates a safe space for what Schippers calls turnaround leadership. This involves leaders who have the psychological safety and the courage to step forward and say, we handled this poorly. We relied on bad, opaque data. We ignored the behavioral fallout, and we need to fundamentally change course.
And she couples this idea with structural changes too, right?
She does. She pushes for a move toward more direct democracy, where the public has more immediate structural power to check government overreach before it calcifies into multi-year policies.
Yeah.
From her perspective, this combination of radical transparency and structural reform is the only viable path to actually healing the societal trauma she identified back in 2020.
Man, let's try to pull all of these massive concepts together because we've covered a tremendous amount of ground analyzing this interview.
We really have.
We started with Michaéla Schippers and the deeply unseen, unmeasured collateral damage of crisis management, the explosive mental health crisis, the endless waiting lists, the societal muscle atrophy caused by applying the full-body cast of lockdowns to address a localized threat.
And then we moved into the mathematical realm with Ronald Meester, exposing the illusion of absolute certainty. We looked at the mechanics of how black box models with subjective assumptions, simplistic parameters, and shifted statistical baselines were used to generate the hard numbers that politicians desperately needed to justify their actions.
We analyzed the structural failure of an overwhelmed parliament that abdicated its moral responsibility by hiding behind the shield of follow the science. They fundamentally failed to realize that descriptive science cannot answer normative, moral questions.
And finally, we looked at the aftermath, how human ego, institutional gaslighting, and the sunk cost fallacy are currently preventing real accountability, making the radical transparency of truth commissions potentially the only way out of the gridlock.
For anyone listening, applying this critique to your own consumption of information yields two critical takeaways. First, whenever you are presented with a startling statistic, a terrifying graph on the evening news, or a claim about excess mortality, always ask yourself, what is the baseline?
Always look for the baseline.
How is the normal being defined by the people presenting the data? And has someone quietly moved the price tag on the jacket before putting it on sale?
And second, whenever a leader, a CEO, or a politician claims they are simply following the science to justify a disruptive policy, you need to ask a critical translation question.
Jizz.
Are they genuinely using science to answer a complex, descriptive mathematical question? Or are they using the word science as a political shield to hide from the responsibility of making a difficult moral choice?
Because science is a rigorous method of inquiry, not a moral compass.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought to chew on. We started this deep dive by imagining a leader navigating a crisis using a black box that spits out numbers. But what this interview suggests is that the box isn't just mathematically opaque, it is fiercely guarded by human egos, political careers, and massive institutional inertia. So here's the question for you to ponder long after this audio stops playing. If our modern societal and political structures are so deeply rigid and our public egos are so incredibly fragile that admitting a massive mistake equals absolute professional suicide, how can we ever expect to successfully adapt and survive the next truly unprecedented global crisis?
We might just find ourselves following the exact same broken black box all over again.
Something to think about. Until next time.